you down, and you know.
And the world makes you bad. It's context. Hi again. We got throttled. I'm going to put both these films on the site, but please bear with it, us, the technology, because it is, we get throttled if we try too much, and it's all about the numbers, you know. So we're talking about, in the last one that I'll include on the videos, we're talking about, can creativity be taught? And we're bringing up a couple dramaturgical points on this piece. As you can see below, it's the photos Rick brought in of his father, the context of his father. His father joined the Marines in World War II, certainly saw the bad things in the Pacific Theater, which was nasty, nasty, nasty. I'm a big history freak. I always tell my students that. I want to infect you with this to become big history freaks. Let's proceed with that, Rick, as we said.
Yeah.
Can creativity be taught? And then we hit upon this other idea of why, good. Rick said he picked up a big book of Shakespeare from one of the mall book dealers. Right. Just quickly, I'm going to say I think it was 1314, I picked up Moby Dick, and same thing. I said, it's supposed to be the classic American novel. I don't know why I'm reading this. I'm curious. There's certainly a story in there. And I got to the point about the whiteness of the whale. Mm-hmm. And as a 13, 14-year-old, I thought, this is so effing boring. What am I doing reading a whole chapter on white? You know, the whiteness of the whale. And years later, I realized Melville was trying to talk about ambiguity and language and what the endeavor really means with all the characters. But if I didn't, lesson for you young people, sorry I sound so old saying that, if I didn't trust the boredom, if I didn't trust that this was like granola, it's supposed to be good for you, right? I wouldn't come out the other side and remember that. Now you were saying this about, we were saying about why growing up, we were in public schools, non-fancy public schools. Right. We were supposed to read or hear, I remember the slideshow versions, read or hear Hamlet, Macbeth, Julius Caesar.
Yeah.
I had that. It was like core curriculum.
Right.
Expand on that.
Yeah, and so what I was saying is that I came to it at 13, just grabbing one of these bargain books at a chain bookstore, complete works of Shakespeare, and just flipping through, and I was looking at Lear, for example, and realizing there was something interesting in there beyond it being good for you, or I don't think I associated it with Shakespeare as a even literary figure. I saw it more as looking at it from the drama point of view, where I was like interested in sort of the ideas of it, but also the sort of larger than life characters and this sort of thing. But the thing that I thought was really interesting is the parallels between the Elizabethan world and existentialism, and in this piece that we're writing. And so the key to the creativity, and one of the things we discovered today, was that entering into World War II, everybody was Christian, or at least was supposed to be, and American, and it was supposed to actually seal the deal by going to war. And people volunteered for this war. It wasn't a draft war in World War II, because you were fighting evil. You were fighting on God's side. You were fighting for the Christian way of life, and not this...
And rescuing Jewish people in the Holocaust.
Yeah, and lest we should forget, Judaism is, pre-Christianity. I mean, they're connected, right? And this is notion that there is a design and a divine idea that God has put down here. And so this was somehow almost a holy war. So, but this is, Shakespeare was also living in a time of the crazy chaos and coming out of the wars that Elizabeth had put into place with Spain, with France, with Ireland. I mean, completely surrounded by war with Catholic Christian countries. And here's Shakespeare looking at all this, and we don't know what his religious affiliations were, but he does not promote a Catholic or even a Christian point of view. in Lear especially, and in Macbeth. And these are the
Pagan
plays.
view.
And,
Pagan.
by the way, Julius Caesar. Pagan point of view, Julius Caesar also takes place in Rome, pagan Rome. It's pre-Christian. So all three of those plays look at the chaos of the world and watching the randomness of events and how they go down and how people just do things, and sometimes there are consequences and sometimes there are not. And they're all sort of predicated on the idea of the wheel of fortune, the notion that anything can happen to anybody at any moment. And here we are living in the 21st century, 2022, and yet again today we have yet another strain of COVID that is making us shiver in our shoes and freak out about where the world's going. And then we had a random mass shooting, another one in Buffalo recently.
Oh, really?
Where we're looking at, this guy walked into an 18-year-old kid, just like what's been happening everywhere, shooting people in a black neighborhood intentionally, worried about being replaced as a white guy. And an 18-year-old kid. And so here's this randomness that we can't ride a subway, we can't go to a grocery store, and it's not just here in New York, it's everywhere. Where the chaos of what's going on, and then throw on top of it climate change. We're waiting for the next hurricane to fucking wipe us out again. And, that kind of chaos, and to say that there's some sort of design or plan to this, does this make sense to anybody? And I think that that's what attracts me to Lear, and also attracts me to the story of my own father, because he's coming out of World War II, where things are supposed to be divinely sort of ordained, and the divine ordination is
your moral countenance should be impeccable.
Right, and
you don't loot the dead. You don't kill women and children. You don't.
In fact, the opposite. You're liberating them from this
from tyranny and fascism.
Just like we were thinking we were doing in Vietnam, which we also weren't doing there either. Yeah, or any war, frankly, is about power and imperialism. It's not about these things. But in World War II, we were still in the imprimatur of fascism, so we were sort of still thinking about that. But the spoils of war that were given as a reward for your moral, courage of fighting the evil of fascism was you would get a house, a wife, kids, and a car. And these were your rewards. But this is even more and a job. But this was even more chaotic and had no meaning, because these things are empty shells of what it is to be a human being. If every human being is given this, and it is a quote-unquote middle-class life, anybody could get this. It's completely random. And there's no earning of it, and there's no individual.
But also what happens to the world when China gets it? It's like a Faustian world. It's just more, not speaking out against the sort of sharing of the middle class ideal now that the American middle class is fully disappearing, practically.
But it feels like with China and with Russia, it's the oligarchy that is benefit. Like there's not even a hint that we're trying to create a middle class anymore, or trying to reward good behavior or moral behavior. It's almost the opposite. It's like the more, and I think this is the Earl story that we're working on, is the more you try to do that, the more the Wheel of Fortune just says, fuck it, that's not working.
Spin again. Spin again.
Yeah, good luck trying to make that make sense. It's not going to. So the oligarch, I mean, we see this in the fact that COVID has actually benefited oligarchy. In other words, Jeff Bezos, king of the oligarchs, made money off of COVID. The rest of us are fucked by COVID.
Billions. Delivering to your house, which you would go to the shopkeeper and talk to your shopkeeper, or this is Walmart, the big box over the main street. Absolutely. That's been a fight for a while, and who stocks the big box but Chinese manufacturing.
And all those jobs of manufacturing, like the Detroit line auto workers, all that's gone because it's totally unnecessary. It's all automated. You've got a few people wandering around a giant warehouse in Amazon pulling things from shelves in ridiculously mundane. Again, you're just a cog, and anybody could be
I just
doing
read
this
that
job.
they now Bezos team have new tracking apps on these workers' phones to make them go faster,
Right.
or to reward them at least. It's not as benign as it seems. Good movie kind of about that is Nomadland, the idea of the disenfranchised woman, the off-grid living, and so forth. Let's get back to let's use the word sculpting a piece here, like a sculptor. We turn it today. Rick had a read through. One day I want to point the camera at him so that you students can see this piece and say, oh yeah, that goes there, there's not enough light on that, oh, figure ground relationship, all of that. But what must be running through a hard-boiled STEM student mind, I don't want to call it bean counting, but it's like, what really separates art from propaganda? What do you, I mean, this is just your view. And what I think Rick and I are in concert on is that art is not only supposed to be beautiful or be anti-beauty, pro-beauty, or somehow beauty's involved, beauty and truth, but it's discursive, it's a dialogue. So when we talk about war, the similarities in war, and as Jan Kott, who used to be a Stony Brook professor, wrote an important book, Shakespeare, Our Contemporary, says Shakespeare is like a sponge. It sucks up the current values in the society. Like he compares Lear to Beckett and Endgame. Rick, fill in on Shakespeare the sponge. Shakespeare the hermeneutic, the sponge, the thing that sucks everything up around it.
I also think that there's something that I don't know if we've discussed this or not yet, but Shakespeare may or may not have been a solo author. And as far as the Elizabethans were concerned, it was designed by committee. These plays were written by multiple people because you had to crank out a show and get it up in 2 weeks because you had an audience of paying customers. And that's what they were doing. They weren't writing literature. They weren't writing ideas. They were writing theater as a collective. So it stands to reason that if you've got several people working on, let's say Lear, for example, that it's going to have multiple points of view that absorbs many multiple ideas. And I think that we see this in every generation, that there's
the so-called quality television now, what's it called? Ever since The Sopranos or whatever that
I mean, it's like high-end, HBO drama, basically.
Right.
But HBO drama is meant to be selling tickets. In other words, it's meant to get an audience. But what works in HBO and what works in Shakespeare was the moment of the time is much like our own, where we are in constant war, we are in constant,
uncertainty, chaos, don't know where your next job's coming from.
And don't forget, the Elizabethans lived in a really ridiculous, unhygienic world where they had dead bodies and animals would be left in the street or kicked in the Thames River. They didn't have sanitation. They didn't have sewage.
A shower once a year.
Yeah, and they lived in these chaotic conditions, and a plague, as a consequence, took over and destroyed, almost half the population of London overnight. While King Lear was being written, the Globe Theatre was shut down 4 or 5 times that summer because of the plague. And this is exactly what's happening here in New York City. We were just talking about it. I literally was working up at Lehman College. We just opened a show last week. And then suddenly this week we're having to shut down shows and performances and graduation ceremonies because the plague is back again. So we're on this constant cycle.
Of God.
Yes. Well, if you want to believe that, talk to people who had people die from COVID randomly during this whole thing, and they couldn't even go to their own funerals or see them in the hospital, as they were dying.
Say goodbye by iChat
this
or
was true
iPhone.
of Elizabethan England too. Like, people were dying of. You would see somebody in the street, the next day they'd be dead of plague. And you couldn't even go to their funeral, nor could you go near the body of they used to mark the houses with red crosses and be like, don't go in there. This is a plague house. They literally would lock people away in hibernation, and you either died in there or you came out from quarantine 2-3 weeks. Sometimes it was a month later and survived it. But survive what? And this is what I think Shakespeare was talking about, and I think it's what we're talking about here, is why do we keep moving forward and creating art is a reflection of saying, is showing us, well, what the hell is going on here, and how do we make sense of this?
The fecundity, as I began in the previous video and now, can you teach creativity? There's so much, part of creativity is a response to chaos, right?
Yeah, that's exactly my point, is trying to make sense out of the seemingly nonsensical. I mean, even Jean-Paul Sartre, the king of the nothing is nothing and nothing means anything, and all these random actions add up to nothing, and then when you die, there's nothing after death. Even he wrote stories, and he wrote characters to describe why that was true. Same with Samuel Beckett.
Plays. Sartre's plays.
Yeah, No Exit is a play that discusses this very
novel, thing. It's just so filled with pathos.
Yeah.
And
people struggling with living in a world that is meaningless
Condemned
and
of Altona. Wonderful. Even people writing about nothing. Camus, Sartre, Beckett have this amazing sort of following because it, like Shakespeare, is this sponge. Now Lear is compared to some of the great post-war existential ideals. What are some of those? Just in your father as a post-war character. Let's follow that parallel. It's like existentialism. Lear decides out of the writing committee, imagine the writing pool of friends suddenly one day going like, oh God, 911 happened and now we gotta sell laughs here, but what do we write about, Then imagine your father as an existential character. Frame that, go with that.
Right, so he's coming out of World War II. Well, he's going into World War II as a young, fresh-faced immigrant kid, French-Canadian, and then he goes in as Marcel Desrochers, this French-Canadian kid, and he literally comes out after the war as Earl de Rocher, and literally changing the pronunciation and his name to be an American, to say that I fought in this war, I am an American. But coming out of that, instead of it being a victory and saying, well, you are now an American, aren't you proud to be this thing? These guys had ridiculous PTSD from watching people be randomly murdered and assassinated during the war. But not only their buddies, but also the Japanese, also the German, also they were young men, just like the Russians are today. They were young men sent into this meaningless, crazy battle themselves. So you're actually shooting your fellow 18-year-old from across the world, and a lot of people said this in Vietnam about the Viet Cong. They were like, we're the ones invading their country, and we're killing them on their own turf. And you're telling me this somehow makes sense? And it's completely random. And then you're watching the guy next to you just randomly have his arm blown off or head blown off or And
you wonder why we talked about this.
Why isn't it me? Why am I the one that
Wheel of
survives
Fortune, Rota Fortuna, this concept that, and there's been great literature, the occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, Jacob's Ladder, all of this, the great series, The Pacific, where Remy Malek begins to be a star. It was a great soldier with PTSD in that. Why Earl as an existential, and I'm sure in Camus there's this Marceau in L'Étranger is the same character. Nothing matters to me. New hot girlfriend doesn't matter. My mom died, nothing matters. Shooting an Arab on the beach doesn't matter. Right. And then his whole town is indicting him for not caring. Not because he murdered an Arab on the beach. Right. But so explain Earl. We're hypothesizing, and we don't know about his experience.
Well, why couldn't he be content with coming back from World War II and having a middle class lifestyle, car, wife, house, job? Why isn't that enough? Because there's nothing there. It's empty and meaningless because he didn't earn it and he didn't strive for it. Today, we look at careers, we build them, we go after things. I want to be an engineer.
GPA becomes credit score.
Yeah. No one sets out, I'm sorry to say this, but no one sets out to be a salesman. Like, that's not a thing. That's not like a lifelong dream of somebody set out to be a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer, an actor, or something like this. Who sets out to be a salesman? Nobody. You become a salesman because it's sort of like, okay, this is a job that looks respectable. You wear a suit, you have an office, you have a secretary, everything's in place, but it has no meaning. And a salesman, this is kind of the iconography of an American, of the 1950s, is a salesman is basically selling you something, A, you don't really need. Also is comparing, as we compare the Buick to the Chrysler here, you're basically, you know, a Plymouth, a Buick, a Chrysler, they're all the same car. They're all the same car, just like a Honda, you know, and
Honda.
Yeah, they're all the
Kia.
same. It doesn't matter. They're all the same car. They're all basically have the same function, and you're trying to sell that, and that has some sort of importance. Or a vacuum cleaner to a housewife so she can have a better one than her neighbor. Like, these things are meaningless to people. Like,
but here's the corollary, and I do tell this to my students. 80%, because there's so many talented people in the world, you're studying to be a doctor, 80% of your gig will be to sell yourself. That's the irony. Whether you become a high-powered doctor, lawyer, or I'm a professor entering the gig economy, that selling things is the last thing we want to do on earth, but it's become the first thing we have to do.
Right.
We have to sell ourselves on LinkedIn or Indeed. You know, you've got to be a part of this marketing yourself. Weigh in on that, and weigh in on how Earl more or less succeeds on selling himself, even though the final product is himself. What is he actually selling that you know?
Well, he's working for General Electric, which was actually based in Massachusetts, but it essentially selling electrical plans, so to speak. Not plans like engineer plans, but like, you know, here's your electrical plan for your house, for example. So he's actually selling the notion of like a Con Ed kind of thing.
Right.
But they had choices back then. It wasn't just this monolith of Con Ed, AT&T,
Chrysler, Buick, this.
Yeah, you had choices.
Google, Amazon, Facebook.
So you want to be with General Electric because they do this, they do that. They invent this light bulb. They're all this, have all these things, but you're not making anything and you're not creating anything. You're just selling what already exists and you're hyping it to somebody else. Buy this over that. Buy this insurance over that insurance. Why? Because our company sells this insurance. That company sells that insurance. Not because one's better than the other. And you're also you don't make. What is insurance? You don't make it. There's nothing there. It's just a contract that says if something goes wrong, we'll reimburse you for that because it's an accident or whatnot. So it's not like a job that requires a human being to be in that job. It actually just requires someone to have a persona that is likable and they look the part. And that's, I think, the thing that drives these men, especially in that period, and women, that they realize I could be anybody. I can be replaced with anybody, and we're all basically in the same spot.
Which includes the so-called, I'm teaching at this massive Research One STEM school, and a lot of the students are hyper concerned about GPAs, but also hyper concerned, like, we'll always have doctors. Really? Automation's even entering that field.
Absolutely.
So what? Nothing comes with nothing. To bust your butt, to trust your GPA, which will become your credit score. Mm-hmm. Eventually, right. You are a number. And then, just like in the war, you have this machine come at you, right. the job-eating machine. Right. And suddenly, the thing you spent 20, 25, 30 years studying from grade school to grad school mm-hmm. is poof, gone.
Right.
So expressing Lear abdicates his kingdom because he has it, or because he wants to create chaos. We touched on that. He abdicates because he wants to see his three daughters go at it.
Fight each other, yeah.
Yeah, it's an act of creative destruction.
Self-destruction, yeah. And I think it's also the act of like, well, why not do that? Like, why not crush it and make chaos out of it? Because it's
Thanatos.
It's actually going to happen anyway. No matter what I do, right. In this moment, I could stay in being king and I could die and one of you takes over. in this sort of natural progression, but that could all fall apart tomorrow.
And it turns famously vicious.
Yeah.
And there's the parallel story of Gloucester and his two sons, the natural and the unnatural.
Yeah.
But
I also think that the notion of like Macbeth, which people might know better, is the notion of like, you have been, you've been a war machine. You've been at war. I mean, Macbeth is known for killing people. It's in the first scene. Man, he was a killing machine out there, and he won. And so
no question, no hesitation.
Yeah, and the current king's like, that guy should be the Earl or something, a Duke of Cawdor, which is part of the Elizabethan Empire, and essentially he's like, oh gee, thanks, but I'd rather, like, if I'm gonna get that, maybe I'll get this. Like the randomness of it, and also the reward for being a murderer and being, and being forced into this hero role, and realizing on the other end of it that there's no there's no reason for that to have happened, and my reward for doing that is getting power over other people, and I'll just keep doing that again. So if that worked randomly once, it'll work again.
But he's not alone. He has a society with Lady Macbeth, and there is part of there. It's often the missing child syndrome. They had a baby and it died. It's in there. So right. It's like she's looking, and she's portrayed. Is she an early feminist hero, or is she just June Cleaver on steroids, or what? Who is she that says, husband, do that good thing you do, which is murder.
Right.
Do that thing you do,
and
which
our
is
reward will be the house and the
ironically
car
in that great series called The Pacific, 10 series long, where Dr. Sun returns home and is sitting in front of a pretty employment secretary woman who said, what do you do well? And the guy looks at her like, what do you mean, what do I do well? No, what do you do well? What would you say you do well? He looks at her and says, kill Japanese. That's what I do well. This idea that you can't turn it on
right.
or off, that men, so much of Hemingway's stories coming back from driving ambulance and go like, you have no idea what I saw.
I'm good for destruction. That's what I'm good for. And also, my brother-in-law said that he was in Vietnam. He was in one of these MASH units. You see, it was famous for a TV show called MASH, which is about the Korean War. But in the Vietnam War, he was a medic, basically, and he worked right behind the lines. I mean, he would say that they would bring in bodies that had been all shot up. They would patch them up, only to go back and be shot at again, and eventually they just wouldn't come back. Like, it wasn't like, oh, we're going to heal these guys, send them home, and thank you, you did a great job. It was literally a factory for just patching up human beings, to be sent back into the battle, only to be shot at again and eventually be killed, or if you were lucky enough, and that's kind of arguable. Am I surviving? Is that a positive or a negative? I don't know. But your job is to patch kids up to be shot at and murdered again and again and again. And we see this actually in the show Westworld. I don't know if you've talked about this, but it's actually a brilliant show, I think, for our generation, because it talks about that same thing.
But if they're robots, is it really killing? Is it really rape?
Well, then what you find out is the robots are created by other robots who were eventually, originally created by human beings to have human attributes. So the robots are indeed being used as cannon fodder, just like we kids were in these wars.
But we're almost to the end. Here's an interesting corollary. I learned 3 or 4 months ago, I don't know who it was, MIT or whatever, there's a YouTube thing about making code. It's an AI. So even what we thought, here's the finger of God, the coder, the Steve Jobs, the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musk, they rose because of code, Elon Musk and PayPal, whatever. Now we have machines making code, exactly. AI.
Right.
So just like these metaphors, will we have something like UBI, Universal Basic Income, and will the rise of robots, let's just call it that, speak about the end of war?
Well, obviously not, because we're right in the middle of what. Right now, we have drones that could do all the
Proxy
work
war.
of war. Why are we fighting a ground war in the Ukraine? Why not just?
Why are they the most hated people on the face of the earth, the Russian troops. Why are they fighting an old school tank
they
war?
have drones.
Yeah.
They could be doing that. It's a show too. It's called theater of war.
A dangerous show.
Yeah, it's called theater of war for a reason. It's the show. It's the show of war and all the glorification that comes after that, if you're the winner, of course. And this was the thing in World War II. The reality of World War II is the devastation of Europe was just horrific.
Complete.
And then the devastation of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, post World War II, never even mind in the middle of it, and the same thing with Dresden being leveled, is that what did we get out of doing that? We destroyed an entire, community of people on both sides of the equation. For what purpose? And that's what it comes out, supposedly to stop fascism. But we didn't stop fascism. We still have fascism. In fact, we have it right here, right now, in our very own country with the Trump world. It's a fascist.
It's the orderly, and then the no side has a corner on the market of cruelty or evil.
Right.
We talk about this fresh-faced Quebecois American guy going to the Pacific Theater, maybe seeing the shit, as they used to call it in Vietnam, coming back, and everything, he's like the anti-Midas. Everything he touches doesn't turn to gold.
Right.
So just explain that. What if he is Willy Loman? What if he is...
But I think different from Willy Loman, because this comes up, with the idea of the salesman. But Willy Loman really believed in the fact that his life had meaning. I don't think Earl, coming back from World War II, felt that there was any meaning in what he was doing. I think that was the existential crisis. There is no meaning in this. I could be a successful husband. I could be a successful salesman. I could be a successful father, and it has no meaning. It won't change anything.
Because he saw the shit?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the guy next to him got his head blown off.
And the reward for that is to have a house, a car, a wife, and a kid. What is the value of that if there's no point to being alive? If you're just a survivor, just getting through the day.
Survivors guilt.
Yeah.
Survivor's guilt.
Would you rather be a war hero and go off in that way and be like everybody remembers you as that? I mean, that is kind of how some people are
Audie
viewed.
Murphy, the John Wayne thing.
Yeah,
all
that's
of
what we
that.
remember, not the survivors. I mean, this was a problem in Vietnam. The people who came back were actually vilified for coming back because they spoke of the arbitrariness and the
Unless they did like
futility.
John Kerry did and said, I'm going to throw my Purple Heart out the window or burn it in front of people. Here is an interesting idea. We're trying to make this a sponge, and it is a horrific proxy war in Ukraine. Theater is about, again, to geek out, is about discourse to me. Not about pretty pictures, not about pretty methods, not about whatever, but to increase discourse. So much of our art making now is about propaganda. Are you with me here? And we're trying to say, are we opening up the questions? Let's explain Earl in light of this fentanyl crisis. Young people basically shooting up, knowing that Russian roulette, there's a bullet in one of those chambers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we hear every day about American societies. So explain the sense of, from the perspective of two old guys here, explain the sense of entitlement there. And not just fentanyl, but like taking Adderall when you're young, taking antidepressants when you're young. No question about it, but we want to raise the debate. What's a sense of entitlement in the failure of the American way?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by entitlement that comes out of that, but I do understand that the self-medicating is a way of
that's the entitlement I'm talking about. Self-medicating.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So that's...
Father, I'm having trouble in 7th grade math. Oh, I need Adderall. And then the kid is on Adderall the rest of their life.
Instead of dealing with... I think the problem with 7th grade math is why are we putting so much value on 7th grade math? I have a kid who's now in the 8th grade. In fact, he's struggling with math and was worried about failing. And what's interesting about this with her is that she's like, why? And I was like, why Why are we putting so much pressure on kids to learn something that has no meaning to them and has no value in and of itself? No one's using algebra in life. There's no reason for it. Yes, we can learn how to do quantitative, qualitative thinking, fine, but there's no content there. There's nothing for them to hook into.
And yes, if you want to become a finite mathematician and then go off to Wall Street, that's a choice.
Right, but there's the irony right there, that you're spending all this time like creative learning, and there is a creative mathematics, and I would argue physics is endlessly fascinating. It could be a fascinating field. I was actually interested in myself. And there's a use for the math there, but but not everybody is designed to sort of be in this cookie cutter, this is the way you learn, these are the things that have value, read this, do this math equation, and you get pushed forward. I think people are realizing younger and younger and younger because we have more information that these things are meaningless. Therefore, kids my daughter's age, like 13, 14, are self-medicating already because of this, because in those generations, in our generations, whatnot, we waited a little longer, but the one thing we did fetishize right away was booze, and I think that alcohol is fascinating in and of itself, because it's the one self-medication that everybody is supposed to be sort of embracing, and it's one of the most destructive things going. And
as old as the Egyptians.
Oh my God, yeah, but the Egyptians didn't drink to get drunk. They, you know what I mean, in the sense of it was the quality of it and the sort of celebration of it was a whole other thing. Now we're drinking as a thing to do in and of itself, with no reasoning behind it and no celebration behind it. We just do it because we're unhappy with ourselves and we're filling time, and it's better to be drunk than
So these
sober.
elixirs in our society, trying to look at the framework of a 20-year-old or younger, or 20-year older, it's no longer become an elixir, it is a prosthetic. It is what we do to cope with a chaotic world.
Yeah.
Is this Earl too? Just picture Earl nowadays. Social worker would say, hey man, you need to go to AA. We got some Paxil to take care of depression.
Right.
You might, your leg hurts a little bit. We got some OxyContin for that. You'll be fine.
Right.
Is that our glasses on Earl now? Instead of Jack Daniels, man, that's my medicine, Jack Daniels.
Well, right, but it was also a social lubricant, meaning that it made you one of the American boys, so to speak. It made you a team player.
A madman.
Have a drink with me. That shows a solidarity there. And now, I think the difference is that the Paxils and all this, we don't sit around and take Paxils like as a group sitting around. We don't go to Paxil bars, yet, although we might, you never know. But you know what I mean? I think that's the difference.
Mollies and recreational drugs and all of that stuff.
Well, yeah, I suppose that's true.
But over-the-counter legal drugs.
Yeah, it's not. It's just meant to dull your existence so that you're not like aware of it as much and feeling it as much. And in fact, all these drugs realistically sort of like destroy feeling and emotion, which is sort of interesting coming from the point of view of an actor. Someone who's supposed to be in touch with their feelings, the opposite is happening. We're telling kids and young people to sort of medicate down and don't become aggressive, don't become angry, don't become
empathetic.
sad, don't be in touch with these feelings.
Avoid that at all. Avoid sadness at all costs.
Yeah, and I'm like, it's why? In fact, when someone dies and you feel sad, this is a good thing. This is what you should be feeling. Not medicating yourself to the point where you don't feel it. And I think this is the Earl dilemma. Coming out of World War II, I've seen so much horror that the only way to say that this made sense is to medicate. And then that somehow, that will make me get through the day. If I am not medicated, what am I doing? I'm sitting in an empty house with an empty existence with people I'm totally alien from.
Thinking about the guys I killed.
Yeah, thinking about the dead and the horrors of what went on, and what was the point of that? And why am I still here and they're gone?
Very good. This is Fuel for Creativity, gang.
Yeah.
We will see you soon.
All right.